happens in Ventura County or the Chumash. So that's why we're starting here. So it will be chronological in that sense. The class will be delivered by volunteers from the museum, staff, and occasionally outside guest speakers if they pertain to the subject matter that we are covering. So I would appreciate if anybody here in this audience has a topic in Ventura County history that they feel like they would want to deliver part of a class. It doesn't have to be that you have an hour's worth of material. It might be that you have a really pithy 15 minutes of material, but on a very specific subject. That's great. Let me know. Or if you know an outside speaker who you know of that might be just the right person for a particular topic, that would be a huge help, because that's part of our challenge is finding people who can illuminate all the different phases of history. So I am looking still for people who would like to get involved in actually helping me get the class presenters for the class. The next two classes coming up are on the little flyers we have back there. It's also on the VIC, and anywhere that you want you can find. But the next class is Tuesday, December 3rd. We'll be back here at 10 o'clock in the morning, and Roberta Cordell will be teaching that class, and that will be covering the mission era here in Ventura County and the origins of the mission system, and kind of trying to give us a good grounding in that. So we'll start out with a presentation here in the pavilion, and then we'll actually be doing a walking tour of the mission of Roberta. So that's going to be a tremendous, a really good class. And then the third one coming up in January is Rancho. And I actually wanted to kind of talk to you guys. So you're on my radar, so now that I've passed day of the dead. So we'll be talking about the rancho industry. So that's Monday, January 13th in the afternoon after the DEC meeting. So that's why it's at 1:30, so you can take lunch break and then come back. So that's the first three I've got scheduled. I'll keep your eyes peeled because I'll be scheduling the ones after that for the month. So just keep your eyes open. Those are the first three. We are really fortunate to have in our midst Jerry Browning. Most of you here in the room have met and know who Jerry Browning is, but some of you may not. Jerry Browning is one of the founding members of our volunteer docent group at the museum. And so she was part of a crew that actually worked at the museum when it was on California Street near City Hall, and actually helped move the artifacts down and catalog them to our present site. And it has been Jerry's passion to learn about the Chumash people in Ventura County. And so I have, in my own career here, have been extremely fortunate to be able to learn from Jerry and try to absorb everything that she has learned and been able to pass down, which I think is just apropos since the Chumash had an oral tradition and not a written one, that actually learning from your elders or specialists in your village is the way that you would learn. So it's absolutely appropriate that we would be learning from Jerry. So I gave Jerry the task of, as I say, in two brief sessions this morning, trying to cover a lot of both material culture and spiritual culture of the Chumash. So we'll start with, we'll have a presentation, and then we'll have a short break. We've got coffee, and Jerry, because she just can't sit idle, also brought some wonderful snacks, including acorn cake, which is a great thing to be able to taste, and that's made from her own acorn masa from pounding acorns. And that's a nice segue to the afternoon. Then we'll take a lunch break from about noon till 1, and the afternoon session will reconvene in the gallery space, in our Chumash gallery. And there we'll delve a little bit deeper into material culture, including actually getting our hands on some things. Orville Buck will be joining us. Orville is more of an expert in technology, hunting and fishing technology. We'll be covering almost some of the major technologies of the Chumash. We have artifacts and replica things for you to get your hands on. And then, if you're bold enough, you'll also have a few things in the courtyard where you can, if you've never found an acorn before, you can found one. You've got some yucca. You can try your hand at a little bit of cordage. And
if we had tried to do what we're going to do today, 40 years ago, that's not very long ago, we wouldn't have had a set of chairs. Because we could have told everything we know about the Chumash, or let me amend it, everything we thought we knew about the Chumash. It would have taken maybe 15 minutes max. There just simply wasn't much information out there. And, you know, when the Indians were brought into the mission system, they began to lose their native culture the very day they were brought in. And by the time the missions were secularized, and for Mission San Buenaventura, that was in 1836, they had pretty much lost their native culture. And they were free to leave, but there was no way they could go back to their old way of living. And as more people came to Ventura, there was so much prejudice that many of them denied they were Indian. They said they were Mexican. Of course, they'd been speaking Spanish for many years by that time. And this is something you may not know. The Indians in this country, and that of course included the Chumash, were not even considered to be citizens until 1924, which meant they couldn't vote. They couldn't testify in court against a white person. In some communities, I don't think that was true here, they weren't allowed to own property or send their children to the same schools the white children went to. So it was a difficult situation for many of them. They were relegated to living at a little area down by the mouth of the Ventura River. That actually was land given to them by the Catholic Church after the mission was secularized. And they called it Indian Town. That was the start of an expanded community that later took on the nickname of Tortilla Flats. Their culture by today, I couldn't be up here standing talking to you about them. It was virtually dead. But there was one man who inadvertently maybe saved it. That man was John Peabody Harrington. He was an anthropologist working for the Smithsonian. And he was in this area off and on throughout the first part of the 20th century, interviewing the last of the full-blooded Chumash. He did work with other Indians in the country, but he seems to have had a soft spot in his heart for the Chumash. And that's probably because he grew up in Chumash country. He was born on the East Coast, but when he was 3 years old, his family moved to Santa Barbara. And so he grew up in that city, went on to Stanford, got a degree in anthropology, went on to the Smithsonian, and then the rest, as we usually say, a cliche, is history. And he would come back. He talked to the last, as I said, the last of the full-blooded Chumash. He was like a man obsessed. He could see that the old Indian ways were very quickly disappearing, and he was determined to get everything down on paper just as quickly as he could get it down. The only problem was, once he got it down on paper, he tended to forget about it. He wrote on any little scrap of paper that was handy. He wrote in a hurry. He wrote in pencil. He had his own system of abbreviations and symbols. Then he just tossed those papers into boxes, thinking, oh, I'll get around to it someday. Well, he was a brilliant researcher, but he wasn't too big on organization. And after he died in 1961, hundreds of boxes of material were put into storage at the Smithsonian, and for a number of years, they were left untouched. Then, around the late 1960s, particularly the 70s, 80s, and on into the 90s, modern researchers got into that material. And as you can imagine, they found a treasure. It was kind of a buried treasure because they had to do the organizing. They had to decipher these symbols and abbreviations and pull all the different parts together. He'd start on a subject, switch all of a sudden to some other subject. Maybe come back to the first one, maybe not. Sometimes there were years before he got back to it. But they pulled it all together, and some absolutely marvelous books have come out of all of this. And almost 100% of what I'm going to be telling you today has come from those books. And speaking of books, if you're all intrigued by this man, this is a book, I don't know, do you know, Orville, if we still have it in our docent library? Encounter with an Angry God by Carol Beth Laird. And that's Carobethlard. She was his ex-wife. She was married to him at the time he was doing this work. It's basically her autobiography, but it has to be his biography too. And it's really quite intriguing, so I would recommend it, that one. Pardon me? Carol Beth. And let's see, I need to turn this on. Turn that on.
We should have tested to see.
I mean, the curtains.
Yeah, well, you're the first.
Here's where I'm going to need 3 hands.
Was that not the first one you wanted here?
No, the second.
No, we're going. We're going the other way.
Go on. Get to the. All right. Most of these slides are from Indian Hall at Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And the first slide was a small diorama, and it would have been hard to see anyway, so maybe it's a good thing we skipped it. But it showed a day in the life of the way, way back ancestors of the Chumash. People who in this area are usually called Oak Grove people. Now we're talking about a period of time of maybe 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. And it showed them building their home, which was semi-subterranean. They would dig a pit about 3 feet deep, maybe 13 to 15 feet in diameter, and mount tree branches and brush over that. And they generally lived in small family groups or small bands, sometimes an extended family. And as a rule, they didn't come right down here to the beach to live, although they might have come to gather shellfish. One of the largest, if not the largest, was right out here in Oakview on a bluff. Can you see that pretty well? I mean, sort of. The large stone in the center is the milling stone. That's the artifact that gives these people a more proper name, milling stone culture. Oak Grove is local, milling stone is universal. And milling stone and a smaller handheld muller in there, and here's another one, are the artifacts found in the largest numbers in their village sites. In the lower left-hand corner are some of their stone tools. They were Stone Age people. They did not use metal. And the first tool, probably, almost certainly, ever used by man was a rock picked up off the ground. Is there anybody here who has never picked up a rock and used it as a hammer? Yeah, the hammer stone was undoubtedly the first one. If that stone is chipped in such a way as to give it a sharp point or sharp edge, it made a pretty decent scraper or axe. Beat that curtain in. intriguing items ever found in their village sites. These are believed to be charm stones. The larger one representing a frog, the smaller one a tadpole. Those are universal symbols for rain and for fertility. The interesting thing, or one of the interesting things about these is that they're made of a stone that is not indigenous to this area. They're diorite. Now maybe those stones washed down through natural waterways, were picked up by some early resident of Oakview and carved. But there's just as much possibility they were brought in by the very first people to come here. And that could have been 10,000 years or so ago. And they've been examined by anthropologists all over the country. And if they are, in fact, 9,000 or 10,000 years old, they are the oldest art objects found in the round in the Western Hemisphere. And they are found about 7 miles from here, out here in Oakview. This one is not too easy to see, but this represents a later period of time. The large stone with the black ring on it indicates two things. One, they were making baskets. Two, they were making use of asphalt or tar. They did not so much use that big flat grinding stone, that milling stone, but they were now making baskets. You know, it takes a long time to make a basket. It doesn't take very long if you're pounding in it for the bottom to wear out. But if they could glue that with asphalt into a flat stone, they had a pretty good basket hopper or basket mortar. Another advancement in their technology is they were now making true mortars out of stone. Chumash, by the way, did not have pottery. They never made it until the mission period. But they were beginning to make baskets or bowls out of stone. The 5-part picture shows a man using what 50% of the anthropologists would call an atlatl. The other 50% would call an atlatl. That's an Aztec word. It means spear thrower. Essentially, it's an extension of the arm. And as you can see by the upper picture, he brings it back over his shoulder. It, by the way, is it's of wood, although way, way back, thousands of years ago, they probably used bone. It's about 18 inches long, has a notch at one end, and the butt end of the spear would fit under that, has 2 finger loops or holes for the thumb and forefinger. So he brings it back, gives it a strong thrust forward, and releases the spear, but hangs on to the spear thrower. That allows the spear to go farther and faster. It's also safer because he doesn't have to get quite so close to the animal. And some of their other projectile points, we would not call these arrowheads. To be an arrowhead, it shouldn't be over about 1 inch long. Any bigger than that, it probably wouldn't fly. And one of their finely made spear points. Now this is the worst slide you're going to see, but this is bringing us up into the Chumash era. And they are no longer building the subterranean homes, but building their homes on the ground. They would gather long willow poles, usually 19 or 20 feet in length, stand them all around a circle that they had drawn with a giant compass that included a tall pole, a long rope, and a short stick. And they would have stood that pole in the center of where they wanted the house to be. Stretch the rope out, draw a circle. They would stand those poles around that circle, bend them over, tie smaller ones around the edge, and then thatch them with tule. And they did the layers of tule starting at the bottom, the next layer overlapped the bottom one, and so forth. That allowed the rain to fall, not go into the house. Another way they kept the rain out was to dig a trench around the house and slope it away from the house. There was a smoke hole in the top, and the doors are quite low. They're only about 4 feet high, which meant that the person, an adult, would have to bend over to go in. And as I told those of you who were at the Saturday program a week and a half ago, that was both for practical reasons and symbolic. Practical because it kept the house warmer, somewhat cleaner. Also, the bigger the aperture, the weaker the house. But symbolic because the home was a place of safety. And it was by bending over, having to go in, it was like going back to the safety of the womb. Now this is a little difficult to see, but these are a bow and some of their arrows. The bow is a replica. The arrows were found in caves in the mountains. They had a variety of bows and arrows depending on the type of hunting that they were doing. Their preferred wood for a bow is juniper wood. They would smear that with pine pitch or tar and then wrap it with sinew. The item right here is one of their quivers. They used any number of animals to make the skin to make a quiver. This one happens to be deer skin. The only animal they wouldn't use was a raccoon. They believed that the qualities of an animal were carried over into anything made from that animal. They said the raccoon was a thief, and to make a quiver out of his skin brought bad luck to the hunter. One that was just dandy and really took little, if any, modification was the tail of a mountain lion. And here we have some hunters going out. They would skin the female deer, leaving the head and forelegs intact. They stuff those with grasses, put them on, go out into the meadow, turning this way and that as though they were grazing, and hopefully that would attract the male deer. And they would rub their bodies with sage to disguise their human scent. They also sometimes would burn laurel wood. They said that acted as a narcotic, made the male deer kind of spacey and easier to kill. We like to say today that there are 3 things that Chumash are famous for. One of them is their canoe. And we're told that these were unique, that nowhere else in the world was this type of canoe made. The similar ones along the Nile, some in the South Pacific, some along the coast of Chile, but not exactly the same. The Gabrielino to the south of the Chumash had a similar one, but not with quite the same features, and it's believed they copied it after the Chumash. They ranged in size from about 8 or 10 feet to over 30 feet. The larger ones could go all the way up to the islands. They were really quite seaworthy, although they always took someone along to bail the water out because it would slosh over the top. Now it looks here like it's 3 tiers. Normally they were 6 tiers. They used driftwood because it was seasoned from the salt in the ocean water. And most of the driftwood came from Santa Rosa Island. The name for Santa Rosa Island is Wima, which means driftwood. And for a price, the islanders would cut the boards to size and sand them down. And they would start with the bottom. They would make a bottom of 1 piece. And then they would start with the bottom tier and put those together with their very own form of Gorilla Glue. It was a mixture of pine pitch and tar. It was something they called yoke. And you notice how it's tapered. Well, in order to do that and to bend these boards, they would have to dig a pit, line it with mud, build a fire in it to harden the mud, and then fill it with water that they heated with hot rocks, lots of hot rocks, and then put the boards in for about an hour until they were pliable enough. After they got it all put together, they actually sewed it together. You know, you don't want to get out there in the middle of the ocean, no matter how good your canoe is, and have it fall apart. So this was an added precaution, and they would sew it together with milkweed fiber. One distinctive feature are what are called ears, and this picture looks strange to me because usually they played their fishing lines out from either end rather than over the side. And some of their circular fish hooks. The fish hooks and the canoe are very similar to those found in the South Pacific even today. And it's for that reason, or one of the reasons, that many of today's Chumash feel that their ancestors came from the South Pacific. It's very difficult to see, but we'll move on shortly. But this shows that the Chumash culture had advanced to the point where they had a class system. And that could only happen because of trade, commercialism, craft work, and they became very wealthy. They not only were the largest Native American group in California, they were probably, almost certainly, the wealthiest. In the light-colored crescent are the upper class, this about 25% of the population. And as in most cultures, the bulk of the population belonged to the middle class, and then there was the lower class. Let's see if this sounds familiar. The middle class was taxed. They helped to support the upper class. But the upper class had to take care of the lower class. So they had their welfare and their systems very much like ours. Let's move on. This is the upper class. She is wearing a skirt of the fabric for women's wear, sea otter skin. Now, the people in the middle class couldn't have afforded that because it was a trade item from the islands. She's wearing clamshell beads, and she has trimmed her skirt with, it looks like limpet, but often they would use abalone. Abalone shell was basically a trade item from the islands, and so it was very expensive. It was kind of like the Chumash diamond. He has a large pendant of it, and he has a long knee-length cloak of bear skin. The only people allowed to wear that cloak of bear skin were the chiefs of the villages and those in the very prestigious Brotherhood of the Canoe. Not just anybody could own a canoe, not just anybody could build a canoe. That was secret knowledge that was passed down from one generation to the next. And those that belonged to that brotherhood were among the elite. And the middle class. And she's wearing a skirt of impassable fabric, deerskin, trimmed with seashells, not abalone. And she's wearing shell beads, but not clamshell. Hers would have been of olivella shells, which is of a lesser denomination than the clamshells. He's wearing, well, not much, but he does have a string belt. He attaches his tools to that. And he also has his jewelry. And the lower class. And her skirt is kind of like a Hawaiian grass skirt. It's made of tule. And they have jewelry, but not seashell. It would have been a stone. And did you notice that all the women have the same body paint? Now, I suppose in their daily lives they could wear body paint or not, depending on their preference. But when they went to a big gathering where many villages were present, each village had its own design. That way they could tell who was from Shishalope down here on the beach, and Aha, and Woo Woo, and so forth. This is a typical middle-class mom. She has her body paint. She's cooking her dinner of, I don't know, acorn deer stew or something. And she, I don't know, her face, it's dark. She has tattoos on her face. The girls during their puberty rites were tattooed on their chins, and then after they were married, they extended that up the sides of their faces. The baby is in a cradle board made by her daddy. It was the father's responsibility to make the cradle board for the baby. And of course, since the baby was kept in the cradle board for a good 2 years, he had to make different ones of different sizes. It has a Y-shaped wooden frame and then kind of a basketry carrier. These are items that were part of their decorative items. They loved to decorate themselves, and many of these were found in graves. They would bury some of the personal possessions when someone died, and they did, by the way, believe in burial. The only time they didn't was if a person died a great distance away from home, and then they might cremate that person. The abalone at the top, these obviously belong to a wealthy person, perhaps the rattlesnake shaman. The Chumash believed that the rattlesnake was frightened when the sun would glint off of the abalone, and it was then easier to kill. These are hard to see. These are